There are various pathways and styles to recovery. A leading recovery advocate and researcher says much like there are many pathways to addiction, each person initiates recovery in different and complex ways. There are multiple etiological pathways into addiction that unfold in highly variable patterns, courses, and outcomes that respond to quite different treatment approaches and that are resolved through a wide variety of recovery styles and support services. The term pathway typically refers to the different routes of recovery initiation. So each pathway has its supporters and its detractors, but even the earliest of recovery advocates, AA co-founder Bill Wilson, noted that the roads to recovery are many. Styles of recovery depict variations in beliefs and recovery support rituals within each particular pathway to recovery. So we have various pathways to recovery, and then within each pathway, we have various styles within each pathway. Two common styles of recovery include the degree of identification a person has with a disease and the recovery process and how much this becomes a part of one's identity. The second is the degree to which one relates to other people who share this recovery process. It's important to note that barriers within one pathway might be an asset for another. For instance, Celebrate Recovery is a mutual aid recovery program that applies the 12 steps from Alcoholics Anonymous communities to biblical principles that align with the Christian faith. And while this might be an asset to one person, this might be a barrier to another. Take a guess. How many pathways to recovery exist? Research has shown that there are at least 18 different types of pathways, and there are multiple variations and styles within each pathway. And it's common for folks to use multiple pathways. In fact, research shows that about 78% of people in recovery use multiple pathways, whereas only 21% use a single pathway, with a range in number of pathways between 2 and 5. So it's very common for folks to integrate a lot of supports into their recovery journey, into their recovery process. This is why a coordinated network of supports providing as many resources to recovery is so important. And it's also important to note that pathways and styles of recovery evolve over time. Someone in early recovery might find one pathway or style more beneficial, but later in recovery use an entirely different pathway and style. This graph shows the percentage of folks in recovery who report using a specific pathway. As you can see, the most common pathway is mutual aid groups who are 12-step based. So this is stuff like Alcoholics Anonymous and Narcotics Anonymous. Next, we see faith-based recovery groups such as Celebrate Recovery. We see body work, things like yoga and massage. We see the criminal justice system, things like incarceration or drug courts. We see natural recovery, or what has been called sometimes recovery without treatment. We see mutual aid or non-12-step oriented groups such as Smart Recovery, which the Spartan Recovery Program offers here at UNC Greensboro. We see outpatient treatment, and we see some cultural forms of recovery, and such as a sweat lodge. So how does one choose a pathway to recovery? And this is just as complex as the way that addictions emerge. But often this decision is influenced by recovery capital. And recovery capital is defined as the internal and external resources that people have to initiate and sustain their recovery. And recovery capital in and of itself is a significant predictor of sustained recovery and quality of life. So, for instance, a person with more financial capital might have access to more treatment options than a person with less financial capital. A person with more social capital might use a more natural pathway, whereas someone without it might choose mutual aid support groups like Alcoholics Anonymous. And it's important to note that the Spartan Recovery Program does not endorse or support one pathway over another. Instead, the Spartan Recovery Program views that all pathways are important and valuable to students in recovery. The Spartan Recovery Program works closely with students in recovery to help them develop and create an individual plan for their recovery and their wellness. As you now know, within each pathway, there are various styles that exist on a continuum. Some common variations in style have to do with how abstinence, spirituality, and recovery identity are addressed. Styles of recovery vary based upon the degree to which they require total abstinence from substances. And this is likely the most controversial of all topics in the addiction and recovery fields. Let me again highlight that there are supporters and detractors of each, and research to support each. But by far the most safe and secure style of recovery are those that include abstinence from all drugs and or alcohol unless prescribed by a physician. There are abstinence-based styles, and this calls for a complete cessation of one's primary drugs and the non-medical use of other psychoactive substances. And depending upon the recovery community, sometimes nicotine, caffeine, and prescription drugs are even excluded from the recovery process. And in fact, some people in recovery communities might not view you as in recovery if you continue to use nicotine, caffeine, or even prescription drugs. And this has historically been the culturally prescribed approach that has guided mainstream treatment in the US for decades. However, there are now moderation-based styles of recovery. And this is based upon the sustained deceleration of substance use to a level that is subclinical. So a person might continue to use drugs, but they use it in a way that doesn't meet those criteria for a substance use disorder that we mentioned earlier. And this has triggered great debates in the United States as well as across the world. But it focuses on moderation management, it focuses on balance, it focuses on self-management and personal responsibility over substance use. And this is difficult when you think about balancing the disease model, the science of the brain, with these other forms of recovery. And there's also medication-assisted recovery. And this is the use of medically monitored pharmaceutical agents that support the recovery from addiction. These include detox agents such as clonidine, or even stabilizing agents such as methadone, aversive agents such as disulfiram, antagonizing agents such as naloxone, and anti-craving agents such as naltrexone. So they also include medications used to lower the risk of relapse via symptom suppression or one or more co-occurring physical or psychiatric disorders. Now, there has traditionally been stigma attached to medication-assisted recovery, such as methadone or Suboxone, and even by those in recovery. But this is being challenged with increasing research evidence and advocacy of persons that endorse this style of recovery. So one goal of such advocacy is to have people in medication-assisted recovery recognized as legitimate members of the recovery community. This is one reason why the Spartan Recovery Program does not endorse one style or pathway over the other. Instead, again, we work with individuals to create an individualized recovery and wellness plan that is culturally appropriate to them. Another controversial element of recovery styles is the degree to which spirituality is infused in the practices. There is secular recovery, those that have no reference to God, higher power, or anything of the sorts. There is spiritual recovery, which has some reference to a higher power, but they have no specific religious affiliation. And then there are religious or faith-based recovery, and these are ones that have a strong religious affiliation, such as Celebrate Recovery. Styles and pathways of recovery also differ in the degree to which one self-identifies with the statuses of addiction and recovery, and the degree to which one initiates and sustains recovery in isolation from or in relationship with other people in recovery. Now, this is very important to the work that we do, because we know that identity is a key developmental milestone for all college students. And this can be especially difficult for students in recovery from an addiction. Not only do students in recovery have to manage and wrestle with their personal identity, their identity as a student, they also have this new identity as a person in recovery. There are three types of recovery identities that have been identified in research. The first would be illustrated by someone who might say, I am an addict or I am in recovery, but I don't tell anyone, except in mutual support meetings. I've experienced barriers, stigma, etc., associated with my status that have led to shame, to internalized stigma with my status. The next is illustrated by a person who might say, I have resolved my alcohol and other drug problems, but I don't identify as being an addict or in recovery, or disclose about my problems to anyone. And finally, I am an addict. I am a person in recovery, and I talk about it freely. My status is a major component of my identity. Now, this is an important consideration as it has direct influences on advocacy efforts, access to peer support, and other resources. Knowing about the various recovery identities can help you to identify students in recovery and promote a sense of solidarity among a group that might commonly feel invisible or isolated. Variations in recovery identity are often influenced by the way folks interpret a very important tradition of 12-step communities related to anonymity. And anonymity is a long-held tradition in many recovery communities, specifically those aligning with the 12-step model. Specifically, the 12th tradition of Alcoholics Anonymous communities reads that anonymity is the spiritual foundation of all our traditions, even reminding us to place principles before personalities. Now, this long-held tradition has had many interpretations and has a significant impact on one's recovery identity. And regardless of one's belief about anonymity, it is important to respect a person's anonymity and support their recovery identity, whatever that might be. This is especially important when considering a referral to the Spartan Recovery Program. Students can be involved in the Spartan Recovery Program and still maintain their anonymity. However, advocacy is a large part of what the Spartan Recovery Program does, and each student is encouraged to reflect upon their recovery identity in order to participate in these advocacy efforts. So we've learned a lot so far. Now let's take a moment to reflect upon what we have learned up until this point. I want you to think about how you can help create a recovery-oriented system of care here at UNC Greensboro. In your role at UNC Greensboro, how can you be recovery-minded? How can your role be used to promote recovery on campus? How can you bring faces and voices of recovery to the current groups, committees, task forces, organizations, departments that you exist in?